Culture and Strategy. Stories about revolutionary ecology. By the counterintuitive. When one of U.S. falls, 1,000 will take his or her place. Fred Hampton, Chairman, Black Panther Party. No matter the degree of top-down repression and violence that exists, the spirit of revolution cannot be quelled, can never be subjected to total surrender. To the contrary, it will continue to evolve and mutate until all are truly free. End quote. Ward Churchill on the justice of roosting chickens. And by all, I mean not just human beings, but also every creature, ecosystems that live and regenerate, including the forests, rivers, mountains, and the seas. The natural, material, and the spiritual essence of the host planet. A diverse cross-section of human beings from all continents and ages who adamantly refuse to allow capitalism, vicious corporations, and horrible governments to destroy Mother Earth. Igniting a Revolution, Stephen Best and Anthony Nocella. The following story is about proletarian cultures and their relationship to strategy. Culture can be understood as ability and practice, while strategy is something we devise in order to combat crisis. Insurgents and revolutionary environmentalism, direct action, sabotage, new insights, movements and coalitions that represent a global proletarian spirit, and what John Bellamy Foster has outlined as our return to nature. A very powerful ecological awakening. Those who are not part of such revolutions, cultures, and corresponding strategies are the ones who usually sit back and speculate, opine for reform, or worse, just doom out, chasing the bright green abstractions of capitalism and never-ending news of climate catastrophes. Situated far from the many coalitions of the willing. Antonio Gramsci. For now, to hell with them. Turning ink into monkey wrenches. Earth first. Revolutionary ecology has a historic relationship with common people, using grassroots power, citizen engagement, to fight against human greed and arrogance. Call for revolutionary action to reverse the accelerating pace of our planet's destruction. Igniting a Revolution, Stephen Best and Anthony Nocella. The trajectory takes us back to Britain, mid-1980s, as in, quote, revolutionary ecology, end quote, that came about from a hybrid of ideas, anarchist motivations, based on emerging science, taken from the social and deep ecology camps, Arne Naess, Murray Bookchin, Penny Linkola, Peter Kropotkin, etc. At the helm, putting ideas into actions were Earth First, YEF, and the Earth Liberation Front, YELF. And, quote, radical forces are unavoidable, dogmas are ductile, and practice diverges from principle, but we the people and the planet first, end quote, Arne Naess. YEF and ELF proliferation within Europe and then over to North America, 1984 to 2004, attracted not just activists and environmentalists, but also local citizens, farmers, small business owners, artists, college students, teachers, etc. Manifestos of direct action that were culturally close to people's hearts, such as the crisis of air and water pollution, deforestation, falling biodiversity vis-a-vis eco-social problems emerging in respective communities. YELF became notorious, NYT, for setting fire to symbols of ecological destruction, including timber mills, animal farms and labs, SUV dealerships, fast food outlets, highway construction projects, and even an entire ski resort. We may not agree with their tactics, or even their claims that the destruction of property is justified by our dire circumstances and is ethical and essentially non-violent, but we ignore their message of crisis and hope at our own peril. Mike Roselle, founder of Earth First, similar to the Weather Underground, about face and world beyond war, tied to a common goal, to bring the Vietnam War to an end, that also lead to bombing federal buildings, denouncing military conscription, hundreds of roadblocks and protests. So was the case with YEF and YELF units, which unleashed property destruction and arson attacks against several economically and symbolically important targets such as timber industries, housing developments, resorts, in order to bring the ecological war home by attacking corporate exploiters, igniting a revolution. The combined response of the state, corporate, and judicial powers was brutal to say the least, including sustained witch hunts, defamation suits, and legal battles that eventually succeeded in the bankruptcy and dissolution of many YEF and YELF units. Worse was the media coverage of such revolutionary motivations as the emergence of eco-terrorism and widespread violence of domestic terrorists. Johnny Lewis, Assistant Director FBI. It's crucial to note that not one human being was physically harmed during all the violent projects of EF. And ELF, regardless of what claims the FBI, the courts, mainstream media, and the big environmental interests and bodies, many members of ELF are still serving jail sentences. Similarly unsympathetic was the response by the media, the administration, and police during the mass uprisings of Occupy, 2011 to 2012. Nonviolent protests rocked the streets of Washington, D.C., New York, Madrid, Paris, Sydney, Buenos Aires, London, Kuala Lumpur, etc. Sociologist Manuel Castells congratulated Spanish occupiers for the fact that not a single violent incident had been reported after 15 days of camping at various locations within Spain. Militant direct action has a long illustrated history, practiced earlier by hundreds of indigenous communities across the colonized world, followed by hundreds of thousands of industrial workers and farmers based in Russia, Spain, Italy, Britain, China, and Latin America, 1915 to 1955, right down to the so-called eco-terrorists and eco-militants, 1980 to 2000, appears like parts of the same revolutionary spirit, one that is embedded across generations and ethnicities as a proletarian culture with all its corresponding strategies and acts. The deal put forward by Deep Ecology that to be reconnected with nature, we must enter into a new self-realization process rooted in identification with the non-human world. Over time, the principles of deep ecology manifested in unforeseen ways, violent as well as non-violent, direct and indirect, located at the sites of trouble, as well as courtrooms and public spaces. The overall missions, acts of civil disobedience, sabotage, arson, boycott, destruction of private property, freeing caged animals, blowing up pipelines, etc. are all symbolic of a spirit best understood as no compromise. Earth first. Journal. So was the proliferation of zines, art, theater, new media, and collaboration with radical feminists, anti-racists, anti-technologists, anarchists, vegans, and local resistance groups. Check out Do or Die, 1993 to 2003. With new emerging voices and opinions, revolutionary ecology had absorbed other social and proletarian issues such as animal rights, land reform, police violence, racism, homophobia, decolonization, and more. As a contemporary example of localized resistance are the Zapatistas. Broadly refers to the group of people spread across southern Mexico, participating in the anti-globalization struggle for democracy and land reform concentrated in the Chiapas, Mexico, organized around the Zapatista National Liberation Front, with over 300,000 members. How the hell can all such people be deemed terrorist is not even a question, yet such groups then and now validate themselves as justifications for sabotage, armed struggle, and violent actions, especially when we see the invasion, atrocities, robbery, and destruction that is orchestrated by the forces of capitalism and all corresponding forms of modern technology. Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, 1954, highlighted that technological society serves to undermine and alienate experiences of the spirit. An immoral techno-nihilism takes up the void for many men and women who are practically divorced from nature, from Heidegger's spirit of the earth. What mainstream environmentalism and bourgeois planetary reform had avoided from the onset was a direct attack on capitalism. Never to question the modes of production vis-a-vis modes of life. Never to address the deeper inner experience of the felt or lived relationship between one's self and Earth. The question concerning technology. The reasons are objectively clear now. Social ecology, on the other hand, in practice and theory, is a libertarian and decentralized model of social organization which rejects all forms of hierarchy, including the human attempt to dominate nature. What is immediately different about revolutionary ecology and direct action is how we view the planet and ourselves, modern human beings. Social ecologists reject much of the deep ecology message, arguing, for example, that society cannot dispose of its technological evolution, but rather should harmonize technology with ecology. Nor does society need to greatly reduce the large human population the planet now holds, so long as it actually develops sustainable forms of production and consumption. So long as people reduce their actual exuberance and define their own limits to growth greed first. A Qatari or Canadian or Russian who emits 20+ tons of CO2 sitting at home or office, most often doing nothing significant, should least be aware that the global average is still less than 4 tons. News of ecological crisis or widespread destruction of nature often comes late, and so was the case in India, back in the 1960s and 70s. The Chipko movement was the first eco-feminist action group mobilized on the foothills of the Himalayas as a response to protect trees and confront rapid, unchecked deforestation. The Hindi word chipko means to cling or to hug. For well over a decade, the sight of many women and villagers embracing trees, making human chains mapping entire valleys, proliferated their mission to other parts of the country. For a growing nation and its ravenous material demands, the timber and logging industries turned out to be the biggest enemies of subsistence farmers, mountain dwellers as well as hundreds of thousands of women, a rural proletarian energy, trying to stop the destruction of wildlife habitat and preserve the old sustainable modes of living. The images of rural Indian women hugging trees inspired many, not in just rural areas, but also policymakers, environmental groups, and eventually politicians. Srijan, rural self-reliance. We built the dam table, and now we should have a seat around it. Janki Devi, local leader of the Chipko movement. Regardless of nation building, industrial agriculture, and commercial demand, the women of Chipko raised a way more relevant question of right livelihood. A question that was grounded in ecological intelligence, as well as nonviolent civil disobedience. Chipko, at its apex, 1978 to 88, did manage to impact certain environmental policies and save some forests in Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Kashmir, Bihar, Karnataka, and the Northeast. Even as a decentralized movement, a prominent figure like Sundar Lal Bahuguna relentlessly fought alongside small farmers and women for the preservation of forests, wildlife, and water bodies, especially in the lower Himalayan region. The Chipko movement is one example of revolutionary environmentalism, yet it is not about a single group, but rather a collective energy rooted in specific tactics and goals. How to blow up a pipeline. Despite the provocative title, Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, contains no real instructions on how to accomplish that particular deed. The text is a strong argument in favor of eco-socialism, fundamental to a transition from cannibal capitalism, Nancy Fraser. The how-to is a matter of how to think about strategies of political resistance against the forces of business as usual. Malm insists that it is not enough to ask politicians and corporations to destroy less wilderness. It is not enough to stop the construction of new dams, highways, and green-colored projects. Rather, it is our last chance to free our shackled biosphere and directly attack the forces contributing to and indeed accelerating global warming and ecological degradation. According to the author, our dependence on excessive energy systems and the myth of cheap energy itself are both part an ever-intensifying fossil economy that arises in capitalism in the passage from the widespread use of water to coal power in late 18th to early 19th century England. What Andreas Malm calls breaking the spell presents a positive case for political organization and violence. He insists that proletarian eco-socialism, in terms of policy and direct action, can become a global culture as means to combat the biosphere crisis and business as usual. Funny, but the only kind of destructiveness Malm describes in detail is not disabling pipelines, but rather an efficient and convivial way of deflating the tires of SUVs. Direct action as prank, perhaps too jolly and tender to deserve the term sabotage. Yet while doing so, a leaflet must be placed on the windshield. One that explains that this is no ordinary prank, but an admonishment. What you seem to not know or not care about is that all the gasoline you burn to drive your SUV on the city's streets has devastating consequences for others. While the average person based in the West or East can get the newest mobile phone, but as glaring and obvious is the indentured labor within the mines of Congo, South Africa, Peru, India, China, and Chile, as well as the paid atrocities of capitalism across the world. Injustice of the Winners, Omar El Akkad. The return to nature. Not so much about a super movement that embraces all struggles, but rather about decentralized alliances, networks that form new bonds with other groups in fluid and dynamic ways, as such without a global vision, leadership, and outreach. The examples to learn from are there, in the past as well as present. Albeit globally speaking, the situation is getting worse every year, every season. Leaving Eugene, Oregon, we had to evacuate. And we have to travel a long ways. The massive fires on the west coast of the United States had triggered the air quality index up to values of 470, and in some cases over the maximum threshold of 500, an extremely dangerous health situation. Over 40,000 people in Oregon had left their homes, and another 500,000 were waiting to flee if the threat of fire grew. Such is the world of climate change, writes John Bellamy Foster, professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. In his new book, The Return to Nature, Bellamy outlines the trespass of modern environmentalism as the materialist conception of history has no meaning unless it is seen in relation to the materialist conception of nature. The alienation of labor cannot be seen apart from the alienation of nature. For the author, capitalism and capitalist societies cannot provide the solutions necessary as of now for a vast majority of people excluded from the world systems and all the organic life-giving aspects of nature. Bellamy goes further to slam capitalist science, in terms of its totalitarian dialectics, as science as a means of enhancing the exploitation of labor can't be separated from science conceived as the domination of nature. Defined as a metabolic rift that began at the onset of the Industrial Revolution, only grew worse over time, with the proliferation of capitalism, urbanization, division of labor, and still worse unchecked extraction, fossil fuels, and industrialization. Simply understood, our bodies need energy to do everything from moving to thinking to growing. Specific elements, proteins, in the body control all the chemical reactions of metabolism. The growing divisions between human society and the natural world, such growth, or call it overshoot of energy, output, waste, and pollution, has produced a gigantic metabolic rift at a planetary level. But as a theory, there is nothing new here, as John Bellamy Foster reminds us that the observations go back to the beginning of revolutionary ecology. It is prescient here to point out that Karl Marx, Max Weber, and even earlier German chemist Justus von Liebig, 1850, had all pointed out the above crisis, or the larger conceptual framework of emphasizing the metabolic rift between human production and its natural condition. Revolutionary imaginaries in the 21st century are about pluralism. Some say it's about multi-perspectives, while some see it as interdisciplinary and boundary transgressing. Others place it as bridge-building approach, bringing together sundry people and positions that ordinarily never meet, igniting a revolution. No doubt that pathologies of consumerism, the addiction to wealth and technology, the propaganda and counter-propaganda of mass media, and the politics of everyday life eventually call into question one's own complicity in the machines of destruction. Where do we go from here? What will become of future generations? An ecological revolution, or an ecocide sponsored by the biggest winners of capitalism and fossil capital, Andreas Malm. Regardless, the old world order, including imperial techno-industrial powers, are in a serious crisis on multiple fronts. Igniting a revolution equates to a breaking down of various walls and borders. Those that typically exist between social theorists, scientists, radical activists, environmentalists, policymakers, and even political prisoners, former and current. Revolutionary ecology demands we also vanquish boundaries between whites and people of color, men and women, the rural and the urban, between direct action and nonviolence, the human and animal rights advocates, etc. Assimilate and integrate the proletarian worlds of the global South and North, as well as include the indigenous, tribal, and aborigines. Then who is actually left outside such an interpretation? Revolutionary ecology and ecological sanity. By the counterintuitive. In case you wish to pledge support with a paid subscription, click here.